I'm here at Trinity Grammar School at the school chapel for the funeral of Ron Hayman, who was the school sergeant whilst both of us were here.
Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will.
I brought some books up with me, which I'll explain in a minute. Ron Hayman, born 18th of January 1927 at Richmond Hospital. Ron spent the first 13 years of his life living down on the banks of the Nepean River on the floodplain there near Agnes Banks. His father was a worker in the gravel pits along there, and they also had a share farm, a small dairy farm. So Ron was used to getting up early and milking the cows and avoiding the cow pats and so on. When he was 9 years old, his father gave him 2 books by Banjo Patterson. They're here right now. They must be at least 85 years old, I'd say. And he treasured those, and he treasured this particular book too. It was, they're all poetry books. And that, at 9 years of age, that's when his love of poetry started. And I know some of you here will have heard him recite poems. In fact, just less than 2 months ago in his nursing home, one of the staff members said to me, I went into Ron's room today and lo and behold, he started reciting poetry to me. And he knew it. It was up here. He'd read the books, they're well marked, but it was up there, that love of poetry. According to Ron, there was a sad aspect to his life though. He said his father was an alcoholic, and at age 13, he and his mother then moved to a house that was on the Inalls property on the outskirts of Richmond. And sadly, not long after, his father died, and Ron attributed that death to his alcoholism, which many of you might realise that, Ron, if he was ever offered alcohol, would refrain. And I think it probably goes back all that way to what happened with his father. About the age of 15, Ron got his first job. It was at Hawkesbury Agricultural College. He had a number of roles there. He worked in the poultry section, he worked in the science lab as a lab assistant, and he was an assistant to E.A. Southey, the head of Hawkesbury Ag College. And I think Ron seemed to have high regard for Mr. Southey, and he thought he ran a pretty good ship. And I think later on that he might have learned a few things there that put him in good stead, because apparently when he went for his interview at Trinity Grammar School, much of the time in the interview with Mr. Hogg was about, what was it like working for E.A. Southey? And anyway, he got the job at Trinity. After Hawkesbury Ag College, he worked for a few years for a vet in Penrith called T.G. Hungerford, and he had a high regard for T.G. Hungerford and his skills as a veterinarian. I think Ron learned a lot from him too. And then late towards the end of the 1940s, he headed off out west and worked in shearing sheds as a rouseabout from roughly Canamble through Dubbo down towards Cooma way. And in fact, some of you might know the story as to why he ended up retiring and living in Cooma. And it goes back to those shearing days. In January of 1949, he happened to be shearing at a place called Mikalago between Canberra and Cooma. And it was a Saturday, no shearing on the Saturday, and Ron decided he needed a haircut. So what did he do? He got on his push bike and rode to Cooma. Now, I've driven from Canberra to Cooma quite often, and it's not all flat ground. And I looked on Google Maps the other day, and it's 62 kilometres one way. But he got to Cooma, got his hair cut, and way back then decided this is where he'd like to retire to. And he did. And then rode back. There's many other stories about that. But after his shearing days, he then applied for the job at Trinity in 1952, and he got that, and he spent 27 years here as a loyal and conscientious employee. He has many, many stories, and you'll hear more stories from Trinity later on. I'll just share one with you because it seems quite relevant at the moment with the current train strikes that we've been having. Apparently one time when he was in Penrith, he heard that there was going to be a train strike the next day. And so he got up early, rode his push bike from Penrith to Summer Hill. Apparently Mr. Hogg was quite impressed with that. And another episode on his push bike, he had some friends and they were up in the Lower Blue Mountains at Glenbrook, and he said to his friends, I bet you I can ride my push bike no hands all the way to Penrith, and if I do, give me a milkshake. And he did. So he must have been pretty fit in those days. After Trinity, Ron worked for 2 years at Barker College, and then I think it was 5 or 6 years at Bankstown Grammar School. And then he retired and lived in Cooma. He loved living in Cooma. He loved reading, and he had many books. He loved driving around, exploring the country. He's always had a great love for the country. But he also had a great engineering sort of mind. And he loved the Snowy Mountains scheme. He knew all about the Snowy Mountains scheme. And he said to me not long ago, he said, I was talking to John Kell, and I see John's here, and he said, he's interested in engineering, and I've got some books in my library, can you give them to John Kell? And he had all these ideas about diverting water. He said, we should be diverting excess water from Warragamba out west. And believe it or not, just less than 2 months, about 2 months ago, he actually rang up the local state member of parliament, and he said he wanted to have a meeting to discuss ways of diverting water. So his mind has been completely active all these years and interested in ways to sort out things. People that have been to his house in Cooma would realise Ron had invented all sorts of things that would help him live in his house, and he had all sorts of devices to make life easier. He was a faithful and loyal participant at St Paul's Anglican Church in Cooma, and he spoke highly of the church. But I want to speak highly of the people of the church, because when Ron couldn't drive any longer, the folk from the church would pick him up and take him places, and it was practical Christianity again in outworking, just as Richard's pointed out, living every day practical Christianity, and that is how he lived. He was steadfast in his faith, and he lived it out in practical ways every day. For me, when I first met Ron in late 1967, he was my swimming coach at Penrith Swimming Pool, and that's where I met him. But he became far, far more than a swimming coach. He was a mentor. And my parents had died when I was young, and Ron he would look after kids, really. He used to take me and other boys camping. I got to see lots of places. But he also introduced me to Scripture Union camps. And he gave me my first Bible, a New Testament. I read it a few times in my teenage years, and I became a Christian. And again, it's that legacy that he left and the influence that he had. And I'm sure many of you will have similar stories, and I look forward to hearing some of those later on. But I just wanted to share those thoughts with you at this stage of the great influence and input that he had in many people's lives, including mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
Look, firstly, it's an absolute honour to be here to share some thoughts and memories about Uncle Ron. There's a lot of them. He's been part of our family for, I think, over 70 years, I think. I've been talking through some memories with Mum and Dad. I've written down 60 here, but I reckon it's probably beyond 70. So, it's an absolute honour to be here in this chapel. You know, I had the privilege of coming to this school. My brothers went to this school, and I just know that he'd be watching down over us with a smile on his face right now. So, for all that make this possible, I'm very grateful. Our family's grateful, and I know that he'd be smiling down on this right now. So, thank you. When Uncle Ron's just had such a rich history in life. We've heard the people that he's touched over the years and the lives that he's changed. And I'm one of those people too. You know, I must say he's had a huge influence over me, and especially in my teenage years, things were a little bit rough there for a period of time, but I know that he stepped in and played that stabilising role for me. And I remember some of the conversations that we had that sort of still stick with me now. I think probably at the time I probably didn't see them for what they were, but they were seeds that were planted inside of me, and I can stand here as a person that I am and reflect back and know that he's played a significant role in that. So, you know, being a teenager, you take on board what you can, but reflecting back, I know those seeds have come to fruition, and I'm really grateful for that. So, as I said, Uncle Ron's been part of my family for, close to 70 years. He boarded with my auntie Min. He spent a lot of time with Mum and my pop. Mum shared memories of him getting his ute and taking Auntie Min and my nan out to the orchards to get fruit, to take people out onto the land, and the connection to the bush, that real softer side to Uncle Ron that maybe a lot of people didn't get to know. I think if you were a student at Trinity, you probably got to know the disciplinarian, the man of faith, but there was a real soft side to Uncle Ron that was anchored very much in nature, in the bush, and in his faith. So I know he's had a huge influence over my family in those early days, and that's certainly carried through. So there was always a tradition. He'd spend Christmas, back then it was at Auntie Min's place, and then as time progressed, it moved into my family home at Ashfield, just up the road. For decades he'd come and join us at Christmas time, and we'd sit down and talk, and the stories of Trinity would come through and through, and I know Mum really enjoyed that. In my younger years I probably again didn't appreciate that as much. But it was probably in my mid-30s that I realised, hey, I've got this wonderful man who's been a part of my life for such a long time, and this is a person that's a wonderful resource to me. If you knew Uncle Ron well, he could recall details and facts. He could recall names and surnames and dates, and just incredible. incredible. You know, I struggle to remember the names of the kids I went to school with, you know, let alone people beyond that. But it could have been his childhood. You would remember like it was yesterday, and you could feel the emotion in him as he recalled those stories. So I realised that I actually needed to question. I needed to understand more about my history. He knew a lot about my family. He knew a lot about my pop, who I never knew. My pop passed the year I was born, so I'd always line up all these questions, and I got to learn a lot about my history and a lot about who I am as a result of that. And I stand here today really grateful for that. You know, at the time, again, I probably didn't realise it, but I was in my mid 30s and thought, gee, I really need to tap into this memory because it's exceptional. So look, he steered a lot of people in the right direction. I know there was the school sergeant, but he was also someone who was very caring. You know, and again we've heard that he was anchored in his faith very much, and that was something that he lived by. You know, we've heard that, you know, he lived by his example. And set that example to others. You know, he spoke his mind. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and it didn't matter who it was. I remember hearing stories of him pulling the headmaster into line. You know, he wasn't backwards and coming forwards at all. So it didn't matter who you were; you were all equal. You know, whether you were a young person or the headmaster at this school, everyone was equal. You know, he was anchored in fairness. You know, I must say I didn't see the disciplinarian side, but I wouldn't have wanted to get on the wrong side of him at school. I reckon you would have got two barrels if you stepped out of line or you stayed out of line. But he was a fair man. You know, he had a huge heart, and he lived with purpose. You know, and I think as I reflect back, you know, people that live with that purpose, they're the true teachers in this world. They are the ones that pave the way. It's not through what they say, it's actually through what they do. And, you know, he lived by that motto. You know, his heart still beats in this place. You just had to mention Trinity or just sound out T, and his, you know, his eyes would light up. You know, his energy would fill the room. So I know he took a lot of pleasure in directing people in their life and really guiding people. But he was a lover of sport, absolute lover of sport. In fact, I'd say he's more a scholar of sport, you know, a technician. And he would combine that with his power of observation, and he would be able to improve people's time, or he would improve their strength or their technique, or you know, I heard about the swimming. I remember the swimming as well. He actually would talk about that. But he was a real technician. You know, he really understood the mechanics of sport. He absolutely loved it. You know, Dad would tell me that he took pride in pumping weights, and I remember talking to him and saying, "Uncle Ron, like, you're 75, mate. You're still pushing weights at the gym." And he goes, "Yeah, your bone density. You know, you've got to do this. Your strong bone density. It will keep you strong." And I'm thinking, gosh, I'm in my mid-40s now, and I hit the gym a few days a week, and my body's creaking a bit, you know. And you just think, man, he's 75 and he's still pushing weights. So I reckon he's probably closer to 80 when he actually had to stop. But again, one of his mottos: fitness, faith. You know, these are the mottos that he lived by. These are the precursors to a happy and successful life. So Dad tells me that he used to come in and want to arm wrestle my older brothers, and I actually remember he'd come in and start flexing his biceps, and I still remember he was quite fit. But you know, I hope I can continue to keep fit and keep active as he did through to when I'm 75 myself. So yeah, some fond memories there. But I'll just finish up with something. You know, I was a sprinter here at this school. I was an athlete at this school myself. And as a sprinter, you're always taught to run through the line. You know, you don't stop before the line, you don't get out in front and look around, you run through the line. So it's quite a common term for a sprinter to really push through right to the end and beyond. And I think this really sort of encapsulates Uncle Ron. You know, his mind was so sharp when he was physically well. His body started to break down, but his mind was still so physically sharp. And I think he ran through the line, you know, right through to the end and beyond. He ran through the line. So it's an absolute honour to be up here and to be sharing those thoughts. An honour to be here back at this school. He's pretty much the reason why I actually had this education here too. You know, I forgot to mention my dad taught here for 30 years, and he made a recommendation that my dad would be a good fit for this school, and he came in as a maths teacher, and then my dad taught here for 30 years. So back then, students of parents got to come and join the school, and so I had a wonderful opportunity. My brothers had the same opportunity, something that we would never have had Uncle Ron not been in our lives. So I hope his example lives on. I'm sure it will. It's all sitting here in front of me, and well beyond for those people who couldn't make it. So here's to Uncle Ron. Thank you very much for being here, and all the best.
Thank you, Matt.
I also feel very privileged to address you today. I'll speak of my 6 years here at Trinity and my time and experiences with Sarge. I met Sarge in February of 1964 as a brand new to the school year 7 student. I think we called ourselves back then first year students. I unfortunately was dressed in that month of February in full winter uniform. It was long serge pants with jacket, while all my fellow year 7s, and I do mean all of them, were in khaki shorts and shirts. It was difficult. Sarge was sympathetic. We year 7s were all wary of Sarge because we all knew well from the old boys and the boys that did come from the Strathfield Prep, that were we to put a foot wrong, we could end up standing at the front of Sarge's self-described office, the dugout, fearing, depending on the crime that we could be lashed for, and it sometimes did happen. If you knew the call out was to be the next day, you made sure you wore extra underpants. Sarge was very involved in school life, particularly sporting and especially swimming and athletics. Sarge became the coach of my 1966 15A's rugby team, of which I was a member. Sarge hit upon the idea after watching our superior second half performances in trial games that we should have our oranges not at half time but before running on for the game. Now, that didn't necessarily work at all, and Sarge subsequently desisted from it, but we had a lot of humour thinking that Sarge thought somehow that those oranges that we took at half time could improve our performance in the first half if we decided to do so. In my second year at Trinity, Sarge took a group of Trinity boys down to the Snowy Mountains, whereas we've learnt earlier this morning, where he later retired. He did so for our benefit, to better understand and appreciate firsthand, this is in 1965, the enormity of the engineering achievement of the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. This was educational and it was fun. Sarge was diligent in his care and even amusingly participative in naming a room at the mountain lodge we were all staying at after a New Guinea boarder who was a member of that group. This boy's name is today, and has been for over 40 years, emblazoned still across that door. Sarge was a bit of an enigma in that we knew very little about him, even to this day, very little. What we did understand of him at school, though, was that he was predictable, especially in his discipline, his attire, it never varied, his posture, with his elbows pinned to his hips as if he was quick draw McGraw, his language, right you lot, I'll have your ears for ashtrays. And thankfully, and very thankfully, his willingness to listen. We know not of where he came. I certainly, thanks to Graham, learned a lot this morning. Graham, marvellous, really marvellous. Emotional for me too. From where he came, where he lived, nor of his family. His history was his to keep. Sarge was unquestionably devoted to Trinity, and especially our honoured headmaster, the boss, James Wilson Holk. I do hope the name Ronald H. Hayman remains an honoured and perpetual name in the history of this school. May I conclude by saying that I, and I suspect most of the boys in his care, had no idea of what the H stood for. I did, after leaving school, challenge him a few times in a mobile telephone call as to what the H stood for. He wouldn't help me. He kept me guessing. So, much to his chagrin, I decided, after a lengthy time at this, that I would make that decision for him in terms of how it suited me, and I called him Humphrey. So he was Ronald Humphrey Hayman. Let me conclude quickly by saying he was not amused. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Bryce.
So, and here he's also got the when Phil Heath became headmaster of Barker, the letter.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's amazing. He kept that.
What you got, Brian? You always take a photo, mate.
Took a selfie and now we're on the surface.